Are you listening?
This is the Rob Scott Show.
Damn.
I mean, really, like, if we're not trying to change the world, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Rob Scott Show. This is Rob. I'm here with Sarah, as always, and it's good to see you, Sarah. How are you?
It's nice. I really enjoy that. This is, I was just telling my partner that this is one of my favorite parts of my job. So I really like showing up here and doing these with you.
Oh, that's awesome. Good. I love that. You should tell me that too. So I'm happy about that. But like, no,
I'm telling you on recording. So
I agree. Yeah. It's one of my favorite things too. I love it. And today you have some stuff you want to get into, I think, right? You got some,
yeah.
I don't know if it's questions or you got a cool plan. So tell us what you want to go over.
Sure. Yeah. So we've been talking about we've been working through the elements of the fundamental shift and talking about these different concepts that kind of need to be understood to kind of gain the skill so our listeners can gain the skill. And I had some questions for you on modeling. We've talked about it in terms of self and we've talked about it in terms of meaning making, but we haven't specifically spent a lot of time with that concept. And I thought if I have some questions about it, maybe our listeners also might have some questions about it, or they can at least learn from having, you teach me some things today, if you're up for it.
Sure.
Great. So I guess backing up, I would love to kind of have you define what modeling is, and then talk about the three kind of elements that go into modeling, or if in my head there's three. I feel like we've mentioned heuristics, memory, and our meaning making, but kind of just maybe we'll start with what it is.
Yeah, it may be even more than that. And I love that because when you said that there's three things, I was like, oh, cool, you're going to teach me something too. So we'll just do that. Why don't we back up and just say that a lot of this work is really looking at words that we use a lot of the time and possibly even thinking about them very differently. So one thing you and I were joking about earlier, as I'm putting this training together, maybe we should stop talking about it until it's actually there, because I don't want to like overpromise, but what I aspire that thing to do is to really get people to think very differently about time itself, self itself, what thinking is, what do we mean by now in this moment, right? These things that we all say, and we have some sense of what these things mean, but we don't really look at them maybe as deeply as I'm going to invite people to do, so that we can understand them more and see how subtle things are messing us up and getting us all weird. So,
and yeah, sorry, just to jump in real quick before we dive in, we want to make these really valuable for you guys. And so we're we're looking for not only the interesting things to talk about, but kind of the things that we hope that you walk away and you feel better, you feel different, you got a tip or something that you didn't know before you started listening. And part of what I think, you were talking about languaging and words, and it made me think of part of what I think that is, or I hope to give to you guys, is that, to Rob's point, we do use a lot of words and they mean different things to different people, and it makes people think of different things. As we're exploring modeling and memory and meaning, obviously this will start to be more obvious to you. So part of, I hope, kind of the gift of the podcast is helping people at least get a better grasp over these different meanings they have, because a lot of the things that we think we want, a lot of the problems that we're having, a lot of things that we're like, I don't know how to get past this, it's not clear to me, become a lot easier to tackle and solve and face and deal with when you have an understanding of what's happening. Like, I don't like the feeling of feeling like I don't know what's going on and feeling out of control. So I hope that's kind of the gift that we give.
So I love that. And that's really important. I also don't want to wait too long before we like define this, so that people aren't like, what are we talking about, right? Let's not talk for 20 minutes and not ever get to what modeling is. In a super oversimplified way, all I mean by modeling is a process of thinking about the moment or isness or whatever. But to keep it weird, in the way that it can always be a little bit more or different, we end up modeling things and then almost living within that model rather than living within reality. And so, thought and modeling are very close, and in some ways maybe exactly the same thing. A thought may actually be, when we think about it, there's thinking in this moment, but then once you've had a thought and you register that thought, it becomes a memory. So in a lot of ways, I might talk about when you're in the moment and you're modeling, what should I do, what's going on, your thoughts that are coming up are not new thinking necessarily. They're often a past thought you've had, which we could also just call a memory, that's getting overlaid on to the moment. So I'm not even sure that that's going to make sense necessarily, but it's navigating this sense of how much are we living in time? How much are we living in the moment? You know, what's worth it if we think about, you know, how much we're in time over our whole life versus managing this moment right now versus planning the future versus, like, it's complex. We have a lot of things going on. And so an enormous part of navigating all of that is our thinking brain creating models about reality as we go. And so one way to think about that is, in this moment around you, you are doing a lot of modeling that is really unconscious to you. Now, if you're in a deep meditative state and all you're doing is experiencing everything and you're not thinking about any of it at all, consciously or unconsciously, I would say maybe you're doing no modeling. But chances are you're modeling a lot of things, actually. You're modeling where you are. You're modeling to some degree what time it is. You're modeling where do you have to be? Am I doing the right thing? We're constantly judging. And so when I say, if we're thinking about this moment, at any point when you're considering, you know, should I go to the store now or should I go back to work, or what, you know, what am I doing here? Each one of those options, if we think about it that way, is a potential model, right? It's just the future could go like this, or it could go like that, or whatever. And so one of the core mistakes that we make as humans is that we don't see this modeling happening, number one. And number two, we end up living in bad models about things. And a very, very simple example of that might be, you end up being hurt by, we were joking about, you know, like an uncle or something. And, you know, you had a bad experience with an uncle when you were 6 years old and he played too much. And actually, in reality, he's a very nice person. But to your 6-year-old self, he really scared you. And maybe he tackled you too hard and he did something. And so somewhere in your modeling, you labeled this uncle bad or mean or aggressive or whatever. Okay, so now we've got a model of an uncle who's bad or mean or aggressive. And it's not that it's untrue. Like, something happened that justified that for you. Something happened that was real. But now as an adult, if you go to Thanksgiving dinner or whatever, and that uncle comes up, part of that old model can come back online and really change how you interact with this person. And now some of your modeling is incredibly useful and very accurate and really, really good. If you know this person is bad and you don't want to spend time with them or whatever, that can be great information. But because we're doing this so unconsciously and we don't notice it, we're adding modeling onto isness or reality all the time. And when you talk to people about how they're psychologically stuck or what they're suffering with, usually it's with their model. It's not with isness itself. It's not actually with what's really going on in that moment. It's much more about worrying about next summer. And I don't know what to do now to handle next summer. And I'm so worried about what's going to happen then. Or this person, he's a bad person, and you're carrying that model into the moment, et cetera. So if we can't see that we're modeling, and then we don't change our relationship to our own modeling to honor the parts of it that work for us and put down the parts of it that don't, we're going to be, you know, psychologically more stuck in the model rather than actually in isness and bringing our best thinking to the moment.
Yeah, and I like talking about all these things with you because I guess, for lack of better vocabulary, I'll say they feel very nuanced to me. And when we first started talking about modeling, particular using that word, what comes to mind to me is all the ways that we consciously model other people, mirroring body language, the phrases we get from, like, our parents, when you get together with your sibling and people look at you guys, oh, you guys are siblings, right? We, like, do this kind of conscious modeling in general, just to kind of get through the world, modeling what a human is, how you act, and what, it's like context for kind of all your conscious behavior. And as I've been talking about it with you, I'm also starting to see all those ways that we do unconscious modeling, which is perhaps even more, than the conscious modeling. It's just less obvious to the regular person.
Right.
And so going back to talking about the uncle, let's say, the uncle, you make these models based off of a situation that happens. You put this meaning on something, and then it comes with you. And so then that's how you model your behavior and your thinking and all that. So, like, let's say he has, like, just a bad, dry sense of humor or something, and he tells bad jokes.
Yeah.
So if you bring that with you in the context, that's actually very useful, because you're like, oh, well, that was obviously that was a joke, and we don't need to get all offended or whatever. Like, So again, just in this light of like not saying we're all about doing one thing or the other thing, it's building the skill and this flexibility to be able to be aware of your models and like and have useful models. Then
Mm-hmm.
like I love that because it I put something in my head in one situation and I'm like, oh, that's great. And then I'm like, I go into the next situation with that skill of like bring the skill with you. Don't just
Mm-hmm.
flip it to the other side of the coin. But it's kind of nuanced with the conscious and unconscious level of
Yeah,
doing
the
so.
meta skill is it, so it's incredibly skillful to model at all, right? This is
Right.
one of the huge advantages of being a human being. This is, to a great degree, why we're outpacing, or why we have so much control over planet Earth is we're really good at modeling, right? We're really good at imagining things that don't exist, creating a model, doing the behaviors it takes to make certain things happen, right? We're not talking about modeling as a bad thing necessarily. Where we're unconscious and where this leads to conflict individually, where it leads to conflict collectively, is we're often modeling and we don't know that we're doing it. We're taking those models to be reality, and we've gotten something wrong, and now that's often when I talk about us being delusional, right? We don't see that we're modeling, and we're now stuck in a model that's not working for us. Just as an aside, to keep throwing more words at this, because more words are always better, right? Doesn't that make it easier? But sometimes I talk about mental maps, right? And in things like NLP or different psychological arms, they'll talk about a mental map that you create. We could think of a mental map of a situation as a model, right? So it's just another way to sort of say that we are imagining on top of, right? You could think about it as like an augmented reality set of glasses that you're putting on, right? Here's reality, but you're adding this extra data about stuff. I've also called them heuristics. And what I mean by that is there's a certain thing that comes and it's got all this extra ideation about it. So my model of that uncle comes online, and let's not say he tackled me when I was 6, but let's say he does have a dry sense of humor, but I never understood that humor as a kid. So I thought he was just like kind of a jerk. Like I never got the joke. He would say something, be really dry. Everyone else would laugh. I mistook it to mean that they were laughing at me. I didn't get his humor. And what ends up happening is, as an adult now, let's just imagine that over time, I now didn't get close to that uncle because I didn't know him. I couldn't get past it, but I continue to model him that way. So every time that uncle shows up that way, I decide not to spend time. I don't like him. So I behave differently around him. Well, he also doesn't like me because of that, right? So we end up living into a potential model that was an error. Like it wasn't actually right. And so now what we find is that we actually will force people into our models. So let's say as an adult, where I'm totally capable of getting dry humor now, he does a dry humor thing. And later, I'm going to mention it to my partner and say, wasn't Uncle Tony a huge jerk again tonight? And she'd be like, oh, he was only kidding. But it's not okay for me to say he was kidding, even though under different circumstances, I would have been totally okay getting the joke.
Right.
But for me, I saw him as that old, straight up, whatever. And I've put him into my model rather than really had like a fresh interaction with him and a new way of being. Now, that model, if it's keeping me safe, is important, right? If it was violent, let's say it's an uncle that did bad things and I want to stay safe around him or whatever, that's really important. So it's not that I don't want anybody to assume we shouldn't model or we should have this other thing. But if we can see that we're modeling and then challenge our own model as a part of how we're trying to figure out the situation, we can end up with all the benefits of the modeling and then also not get lost in the modeling. And I think that that's a really appropriate way. And this is what we talk about when we get into identity shifting. These are the skills that we want to be able to bring online to navigate relationships and how we think and how we deal with the moment and how we plan and achieve and do all these different things, is to not get lost in limiting models or incorrect models of the world.
Yeah, and I guess, I guess here's like a question, comment, response, but why I wanted to spend almost a whole episode kind of talking about this. Because what struck me, and maybe this is just my own issue with interpreting it, but I wonder if any of our listeners also had the same thought. I don't know why, but modeling, when you talked about modeling and you're saying the word modeling, it was directly attributed to a behavior, to like a verb, to an action, to
Mm.
like relating. When I heard modeling, you talk about modeling, and I was like, oh, it's my behavior in relation to my thought. But the more that you talked about modeling, and you brought in things like memory and how that's a reflection of, that help creates our models, heuristics that come along with our models, I'm seeing that my behavior that I would normally say, oh, well, this is me modeling, like it's me doing
Mhm.
conscious modeling, is actually the reaction to the modeling that's happening in my head, in my
Mhm.
meaning making, in my
Yes.
thinking. And it just became clearer to me in a very, like, I guess I'm still kind of digesting it, but it totally changed the meaning of that word for me to become not the behavior that I do, but oh, there's something going on deeper in my head
Yes.
that then the behavior is a reaction to. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
totally. So I think it is a little bit of a mistake to make behavior and the modeling the same thing, but they're deeply, deeply related. Like how you choose to behave, both I would say consciously and unconsciously, is going to be very related to the model that you think you're in, right? So and I'm giving us all agency that we're creating the model, but let's not mistake that, and let's get even more subtle than that. Most of this is happening unconsciously to you. So it's as if you're in a model that you don't know that you're creating. Like that's the kind of the most unconscious version of it, that your brain is doing it. It's pulling from past memories and all these things. And without very much conscious thought at all, you're making Uncle Tony a certain thing. And you're feeling whether you should be at that party or not. Should you be somewhere else? There's all of these things, which are the whole matrix of your whole behavioral sensation, for sure. Like it's pushing you around that model, but it's the meaning that's, I would say, slightly prior to the behavior. The behavior is usually a reaction to that, and they could feel very similar in time, but if you change the model, your behavior would deeply change. Does that
Yeah,
make sense? Yeah, yeah.
definitely. Yeah, even like all the way down to like, our biology, the how the rate of our heart beating as we like lay in bed and sleep. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Like it is very closely related, but like there is an adjustment. I guess the other question I have, and I didn't prepare Rob or anything, so this is just off the
Yeah,
cuff,
yeah,
is
yeah.
like I would love to know, because modeling feels to me also again like a lot like thinking and meaning making, because I know they're
It
so
is.
closely
It is. That's
related.
that's almost what I was just going to
But
say. I
is
mean,
it the
it's
same thing? I
yeah.
mean,
So let's talk about this. It's almost like frozen thinking. So let's so time matters a lot. Now matters a lot. I really want to go deep on this in future episodes, and certainly in our work back at robscott.com. I want to share this with people. Thinking is what you are thinking, right? The act of actually thinking and consciously moving your models around. Okay, that's what I would say thinking is I'm now going to actively model something else, and I'm going to do that consciously. So we'll talk about conscious thinking is what you're capable of. If I give you a problem and say, what is 2 + 2? And you decide to engage in that and you do that work, that is thinking in this moment. Okay. As we do that, we come to meanings of our thinking. All right. And math isn't, it's just one silly example of that, but so is what is Tony, the uncle? Like, what do I think of Tony? Right. I stop thinking about that at some point and I have a thought, right? The thought is not present, actually. The thought is past thinking, right? So a thought is what I put into my memory. We could think about a thought as actually a memory. It's something that's been considered in the past and maybe was created by thinking that was present at one time. But now I've thought it. So it's literally the past of thinking, right? It's a thought. It's happened already. So now I've had the thought, time keeps going on. And through memory, that gets registered. Now, that doesn't sound like it's a big deal. It just sounds like, oh, that's another memory. That's fine. But what happens is the next time I see Tony, right, that thought pops back online as a lens and alters my new now relationship with Tony. And that past thought will affect my current thinking about Tony. So that is a model, right? I've modeled that old thought is a model of Tony, how good or bad he is, whether he's funny or not, whether he's safe or not, whatever. It's got whatever qualities I've added to it in that quote unquote thought that happened either consciously or unconsciously. Like, when you're 6, you're not really thinking about purposefully remembering things. You're just, we're almost never purposefully remembering things. We're just remembering stuff. And we'll go into this, and maybe we could do a whole nother thing a little bit more deeply on memory, but we'll go pretty deep here for sure. That act of remembering is when something is very emotionally charging and interesting and surprising and new, we tend to remember it more. And the thing that you probably heard me say before, and I've certainly heard it other places, you almost always, if you were alive at the time, remember where you were on September 11th when the the buildings were attacked, et cetera. But you probably don't remember where you were 3 Thursdays ago at 3 p.m. unless you check your calendar. Now, if something happened to you 3 Thursdays ago, maybe you remember that personally, but most of us are not constantly making these really explicit memories. We're remembering really big events, and then much of the rest of our memories it's a little bit bland. There's something there maybe, but it's a lot of times we have to reconstruct it. Oh, what was I doing last Thursday? Oh yeah, I guess I remember sort of that day, whatever, but I need to be prompted in some way. Okay. So that act of something in my thinking, in my perceiving this moment and judging what's happening, if something important happens, my system will create a memory or a thought about it, right? A judgment, a meaning, a thought, whatever, that'll get recorded as a memory. And so a memory is really just a past thought, a judgment about something. Okay.
Right.
And then what's happening in every moment, and this is what's weird about the recursivity of this, we are plastering those old models, and that's why I'm calling it a model instead of just a thought, although I could.
Right.
I mean, I know this is messy and confusing, but to think of it as a model is an easier, almost three-dimensional way to think of like something that I put on to Tony, right? We sometimes call that a lens or whatever, right? So that old thought, that memory, that model of Tony comes into this new moment where Tony doesn't get a fair shot anymore. If you think about that, right? He doesn't get a fair shot because I've already got a model of him from way back when that he's a jerk or he's not safe or he's whatever. And so that's fine. And again, when that's useful, that's great, right? Tony might really be a jerk and our model might be right. But very often we're doing this modeling and it's not exactly right. And our memory's not exactly accurate. And we didn't have all the resources in the moment. And we were scared for a different reason. And stuff gets weird. And so then when I can't get along with Tony presently, I need to know how much of that is my own model of Tony, how much of that is currently who Tony really is, et cetera. And if we can get past where we are creating meanings for ourselves or models or old thoughts about stuff and over prioritizing them, we end up much more free and able to actually get along in the moment rather than carrying old models that are no longer helpful. Does that make any sense at all?
No, I think that's very helpful. And I really liked what you said about, thought versus like thinking, the thinking being the action, thought kind of being the cataloging of a memory,
and old judgment. Thought like deeply affects our present thinking. And
totally.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's really important. So like as much as you show up and have models for everything, we were talking yesterday and I said, are you capable of looking at a refrigerator
right
and not knowing what it is? Right. This is how deep we're putting meaning onto everything all the time. You walk into a room and your mind automatically brings online the meaning of everything in the room. So I would say that is at least slightly away from isness, right? You are not totally present with a brand new refrigerator. You're bringing a concept of refrigerator into it. And that little bit of an addition is totally normal. It's totally human. It's totally amazing. But that's the same kind of thing that we end up doing to Tony or we do to other things. And quite often that extra meaning that we're adding on to stuff is not always useful. In fact, it holds us back in huge ways.
Yeah, it's like we're really, really good at like unconsciously holding a model, which I think in many ways serves most of us as we go through our day. But like, I guess and I like talking about modeling because it brings together, to me, it kind of sews together or glues together all these different floating, we'll say like more like can't put your finger on it type concepts, thinking, meaning, judgment, like these very kind of looser concepts because it kind of glues them together.
It makes it feel spatial, right? It makes it
in like
feel,
this 3D way, which we know our brains have to do to really get something and make a model and make a memory. But like, I mean, maybe if I could just take a second and pretend that I'm like going through a fictional day and just kind of look through all these, it's like, so my alarm goes off and that a little bit that's unconscious modeling because I know oh, that's what that means, wake up, right? There's like
Hmm.
so already these meanings attached to these things that we're like doing before we're barely like have our eyes open.
Yep.
And then it's like, what do you do next? Do you roll out of bed and do push-ups? Do you grab your phone and check your email? Like, there's just, it's almost like everything you do is a choose your own adventure, which you think, oh, I have all this agency over myself and my actions in my day. When the truth is, there's a lot of unconscious modeling, memory,
It's
meaning that's
almost all
already in
unconscious. It's
play.
almost all unconscious. That's the
Right.
thing, is that, so let's back up 1 second. I don't want to take you away from your day, because I'd love you to go further in your day for sure. But what I want people to get, like, why this matters, it only matters if it matters. Like, if your life is great and you like everything and it's all going fantastic, then your modeling is doing well for you. This is a very human, like, this is a huge advantage of being human. This is what we're doing. The problem is when your model starts going wrong. And the way we're going to know that our model's going wrong is we're not going to be doing the behaviors that we actually want to do. We're not going to feel the feelings that we actually want to feel. We're going to have breakdowns in our relationships that we don't want to have. We're going to have, this is where problems start coming up. And an enormous part of your problems, I assure you, is your modeling. 100%, right? Because one of the things in your problems is your model of the world, of that person, of yourself, of all of it. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't legitimate other problems. That other person could be a real problem too. But one of the parts that you definitely want to have ability to alter and change is your own modeling capacity. And if you don't have that, you are stuck within the unconscious modeling that you've been doing and will continue to do until you gain the agency over that modeling, over that thinking, over that thought/memory creation, over the story of yourself, the story of Uncle Tony, the story of all of it. Otherwise, we're very unconscious and we're following models that we don't even see happening. And that's, again, where I often say we're living in a delusion, right? We're living in this delusional model that we don't even see happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I might either agree with you or disagree with you, but I would say that differently. And I feel like my stance is that if you don't feel like this is a problem, it's because you're not aware that this is a problem. Because I would argue that no single person is really doing this to the best of their capabilities. Like, we probably all want something better. And something else we've talked about, maybe that the reason, in my opinion, the reason that it doesn't feel urgent is because it's not that painful. And as soon as it becomes painful, it becomes urgent. But I would argue, because everything is so unconscious, like you said, nearly all of our modeling is actually unconscious, even though it feels very conscious, that there's a lot that we're probably not doing great. And we've just chosen to deeply believe our own delusion about
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah, totally. So I 100%, I'll agree with that. And again, this is like a perspective shift. Like, when you're sitting there alone wondering, is it worth it to even keep listening to the rest of this podcast? Right. You're not going to be in for this journey if your life is kind of going fantastic, right? Like, you probably won't get it. But to Sarah's point, I think we're of the opinion that actually human beings in general need to get better at this, or we're going to keep seeing the dysfunction that we see culturally and in our politics and in our global governance and all these different things. Like, if we can't see that we're doing this and get better at knowing how to do this better, right? Like, so that we can gain and put more of this into our consciousness, that is the skill that's going to help you be happy as an individual, you run your personal love life better, your friendships better, your companies better, our governments better, all of that, because we will get out of the delusion of these mistakes of modeling more and more and more that we're capable of doing.
Yeah. And I'm so like, I think this year's been a hard year for a lot of people. One of the realizations for me personally, just to kind of share with you and everyone listening, is like, I feel so much more interested in people that are interested in not this as in your work, but this idea of like getting better in a bigger way, not just individually gaining, more like creating a better planet Earth. A lot of people this year have noticed that the very, very wealthy people have become even more very wealthy, and the poor and average people have really suffered. It's like, I'm not interested in like who can outdo what single person can outdo one thing. I'm so much more interested in like, what are we doing for each other and the planet in a different way? And when you're talking about modeling and this idea of feeling like kind of in pain about whether we're doing well, I'll say it right, a very dualistic statement, but like the right thing or not. Like I think of I was having a conversation with someone about mask wearing. And I'm like, when you're sitting in a group of people that aren't wearing masks and you're uncomfortable by that because you're maybe in a position where you don't feel very safe or something, this is a very 2020 example, but the people that are not wearing the mask are not suffering. They've chosen to not wear the mask and they aren't thinking about it. They're not like, oh, I'm tense about it. If you go into a situation where you're like, oh, I expect that people will be wearing masks, or I would like a mask, or that person, I thought, their mask isn't over their nose. You're feeling tension, you're feeling stress. It's that idea of, I think it relates to that idea of you're saying we create these models and then we put people in them, right?
Well, let me pause there. Let's not assume that the people without the mask are not struggling also, right? They could be following the social of what their friend next to them is doing, but they actually really wish they were wearing a mask and they're really uncomfortable and they're struggling with it, but they're not going to show you that because they want to look cool to their friend. And like that struggle, that mistaken modeling and what somebody's believing is right to do in the moment and all those things is a part of this confusion, right? It's a part of this difficulty. So just kind of making an assumption that anybody who's choosing to not wear a mask isn't suffering, that may not be true. Somebody could be there going,
Sure.
If it were up to me, I'd wear a mask, but I'm with my husband and he thinks mask wearers are bad. So I'm now deciding to not wear a mask,
Sure.
but I hate that and I'm scared. And so everybody could, we're all doing our suffering thing, right? To whatever degree
Sure.
that we're maybe doing it. Yeah.
And I guess that was more to highlight that when you have this capability, like you're talking about, to see a model, to move within models, to shift models around, you become, and not always, but you can become that uncomfortable person. And that's hard when you're in a room with people that are like loving their models, they're unconsciously in their models. I mean, whether it's, whatever, they might self-report and say, I had a great time. Nothing, like, I thought that was awesome. I'm talking about that kind of situation where you're just like, oh my gosh, like what's wrong with me? Because you feel different because so many people are unconsciously lost in modeling.
Yes.
And so the more that you gain this skill, not that it's bad or will feel uncomfortable all the time, but that's almost to me like when I feel like, oh, what am I missing something? What's going on? Everybody seems like to not be as anxious or whatever. It's my opportunity to check in with myself. It's like my indicator, like, hey, either your model is so different. Why is that? It's like a let me be aware of it. Let me examine it because I know or I agree with you that so much of this is happening for me unconsciously. So that becomes a good indicator. The closest example I could think of is mask wearing, because that seems so, and we all do this different. Like I don't always wear a mask when I feel safe. And I notice that I wear a mask more when I go to somewhere I've never been. Like there's so much going on mentally with like our choices around safety and weird things. But it just, it when you said I said, oh, a lot of it's happening unconsciously. You said most of it's happening unconsciously. That's what it makes me think of.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, almost all of it is unconscious to the average person, without a doubt. Let me take this actually further. We'll get weirder still. It feels like there's a self that's doing this modeling. And what I'm gonna, the bomb drop here is that your self is actually a model, psychological self, right? Not the body here, all this, but that you inside that thinks it has all these preferences and wants to go this way or that way, that is a model also. So this idea of like, I'm the one modeling, it's actually that consciousness or thought or this stage of whatever. And this is, we're going to lose some listeners here, right? But like what's going on is the most persistent part of that model is the story of you. And one way to talk about that, again, to go into like time versus now, is that yourself needs time to exist. And what I mean by that is it needs a story. If I give you any aspect of self, it's going to have whatever opinions, that whole history of memory, that whole what it thinks right and wrong is, like lots of all of those aspects require time. If you can come into now in your consciousness in the way that we teach and that we talk about, and really be present, self actually can't exist there. It's like that just moving truly into this moment. There is no modeling of self going on, because to be in this moment is actually the dissolution of this thinking and modeling that I'm talking about, and being truly in experience. So as you're experiencing the strawberry that you're eating, or what your feet feel like as you walk on the ground and all that, in those moments, you're not modeling an egoic, selfish self that has all these opinions and does all these things. You've dissolved that into this moment. And we all go in and out of this all the time. So everybody listening to this is capable of what I'm talking about. The problem is that what comes on immediately, and what we don't see, what's even deeply unconscious to us, is how much we model a self that has all these opinions and knows everything and has this whole history of what's right and wrong, et cetera. And so that opinionated, believing, knowing, history, certain age, certain kind of person, certain whatever self that feels so deeply persistent, the interesting little tidbit here is that is a model too. That is a it's probably that and your model of the world are the two things that are interacting in the deepest, most unconscious way that we're just kind of recreating all the time, moment by moment.
Yeah, I mean, refer back to an episode or two ago on the self. I love that idea that that self is a model, because it I think one of the things we said on that episode, and I just want to say it again because it was so profound for me, was that, you're not one ever. We think we're one permanent. I'm one permanent Sarah. I'm one. And if I have to change myself, I have to change that one version that I persistently am, versus looking at the self as a model and knowing that there's different selves that you can be
Mm-hmm.
in different moments. And also, just to kind of highlight the bomb drop, which is that the now, the isness, the leaving the modeling, which includes, we'll say, leaving the self, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
The
just
ego,
being
the psychological self, for sure.
right. I'm just like,
Not your
so
body, not your sensations, not those
sure.
things necessarily, right? Because those are going to be a part of this moment too. But the model,
Right.
the thinking, the thoughts, the
The
modeling
mental,
again,
we'll
right?
say the
And
mental prison, right?
yes,
The
right, yeah,
judgment muscle. I mean, all the
yes.
ways that we've talked about it so far. Like, I'm so incredibly grateful that we have that ability as humans, like
Mm-hmm.
everyone, who, no matter who you are. And it's something that you can learn if you don't know how to do it. Because I hope that you can see a little bit from just listening that it's complex. Being a
Mm-hmm.
human being in thinking, in duality, in modeling is complex. And there's things in your control, out of your control, conscious and unconscious. And that ability to step out of it, or always be out of it and step into it, is a gift that we get.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm fortunate, that I think is very fortunate and lucky. And I want to remind people, because I'm not sure we always consciously remember that that's
Yeah.
available.
And you don't have to understand all of it. I'll invite everybody right now just to move your attention to what your breath feels like, feel some sensations inside your body, and notice how different that is to maybe a memory that you have of when you were deeply offended by somebody, right? So if Sarah and I are talking and she offends me, like, what is it that's offended in me? Well, I'm getting attached to a model of me and how I want to be perceived, and this whole psychological self and now I want to prove how I was actually right. And I get, all that whole dance is me not seeing that I'm modeling a self. I've left the moment completely. I'm in the model. I'm in my thinking. I'm not noticing the air in the room or the sun shining, or, I've left, my attention has left those things, and I've left into thinking or the model of some new goal of, like, how do I now prove Sarah wrong, and how do I look smart to the listeners, or whatever that whole thing. All of that is an egoic attachment to me trying to control how it's going to go, because I've got the model. My model's right, your model's wrong, right? Let's duke it out. And this is what we see in all our politics, and everything that we're watching is everybody's kind of arguing for their model. I'm right. And
Right.
if we just can come back to breath, if we can come back into this moment, I don't mean permanently forever, right? This self model absolutely has use, right? I can put it on, I can take a perspective, I can do whatever. But if I get lost in it, that's when we can be absolutely devastated by, somebody not liking our model or calling us wrong or embarrassing us publicly or whatever. But in a quick moment of, if I notice that I'm getting too attached, and I could do that by feeling my emotions get more uncomfortable or whatever. Once you have this skill, I just go, oh, let me put it down. Let me come back to my breath. I'll come into this moment. I leave just quickly the modeling of self, whatever I'm attached to, whatever I was holding on to, I could just put that down, and nothing's changed. Sarah's still there. I'm still here, but now I can reopen to, well, what was Sarah modeling? And is there something I need to say about that? But I don't have to be in a disaster about it. I don't have to be overly attached and lost in my model, rather than back into reality right here with Sarah. And so that's what I really wish I could just kind of do a magic wand and make really clear, is this is like the overlay of the model, how real that feels and how easy it is to actually dissolve it and just come back. And I hope that was clear in the way I just described.
Yeah.
That.
Well, and just to kind of bring that even more to life, like let's imagine that I'm a client of yours and I'm coming to you, Rob the coach. Oh my gosh, Rob, my day and my partner and my kids were doing this, and my job and my boss and this. And you say, okay, all right, Sarah, sit, let's center, like find your feet, find your breath. Mm-hmm. Okay, center. Oh, does that feel good? Does that like quiet that? Yeah. Okay. So I'm all there. All right. Well, but all right. As I got that, now back to this thing, right? Like it's become so persistent to us, and it's such a base skill that we've said before. It's profound, but it's simple, that we don't even, we sometimes miss the power of it. And it's like, no, like that's the answer, right? Because
well,
like you said,
it's not the answer. Just 1 second with that, because that's a great example. And by the way, that's not exactly what my coaching looks like, just to say, but like,
sure.
But there's a big part. Yeah. Let's say we were doing that. Let's say just for a moment, I'm trying to break them up from the model, get them present. What you will then watch, exactly as you said, is they'll go, yeah. Okay, I got that. Now they'll pop back into the model. And then what they'll do is they will make isness, or this moment, like the annoyance. Because they're so attached to the model that as somebody else is going, yeah, but could you just be present? Couldn't you just enjoy your dinner? Or couldn't you just be here? Or just focus on your breath again? Or just watch a movie? Or just put it down? And it's like, no, right? Just this big dramatic, absolute, you don't understand. Do you know what he said to me? Right? Like the whole just deeply attached to what? None of that is going on in this moment. So where is it going on? It's going on in your own modeling. We get overly and deeply attached to our modeling. And so at each moment that we can learn to break up with that, we get freer and freer. Doesn't mean we stop learning how to model. That's going to happen. We keep knowing how to think and how to judge and how to create thoughts about stuff and all those things. But this gains agency to get freer from our trappedness within the model. And where it feels like the walls are closing in, and what do we do and all that stuff.
Right. Because if thinking is the current action, right, or it's the present meaning making that's influenced by thoughts, which are memories, right? It's like these, oh man, I totally had it. And then I think I lost it, but
that's okay.
Was talking about, you were talking about, sorry, listeners, my brain today.
Do it.
Doing its
Go.
own thing. But so you were talking about how that the kind of not being able to break out of these models cause emotions, and you touched on it. But I would say, let's go deeper into the discomfort of the emotions, because again, I think that's a reminder of, hey, there's some modeling that I either need to step out of modeling, or I need to change the model. Because that feeling of being uncomfortable when someone we're resentful or whatever, that's like, okay, we talked about levels of suffering before. That's not great. But if that person that you're resentful for, is your coworker who becomes promoted and somehow becomes your boss, and then somehow becomes the owner of the company, and this resentment is not, your model's not fixed to address kind of the resentment, and it grows and grows and grows and grows. And all of a sudden you're, so stressed at work that you just go home and you check out, you disconnect from your family, let's just take it extreme. You get a drinking habit, you get fired. These discomforts, right, are signs to you that there might be a model that needs to be switched. And it's like, maybe a little uncomfortable, but it's often what grows to the point where then people say, hey, I have this problem. I have
Mhm.
this addiction problem. I have this relationship problem. I have this like
Well, it's
work
often so
problem.
subtle that we don't see the actual source of it. So I love that chain of events you just put together. So let's say you have this little resentment with a coworker, but that stays. And now you're actually faking it with the coworker for a long time. You're pretending to like them, but actually you've got all these resentments. Then they actually get promoted above you. And this is months or a year later, right? Now they're your boss, and they're your boss for a long time. So it's more of these resentments are happening. To your point, this is now making you deeply unhappy in your life. You go home and you're behaving badly. And now with your partner at home, your partner's building resentments about you. Right. And so
More modeling.
so now it's becoming really uncomfortable at home. You're now having reciprocal things with your partner. Now you've developed a habit to feel better of drinking. And now you start drinking too much, whatever. We could be like years down the line.
Years. Right.
And now you go to therapy about your drinking, which I'm not saying that's not issue number one to maybe get out of there if it's become bad or whatever. But then issue number two is like your issue with your wife. And like it's a million moves back to even realize where that began
Right.
with the coworker way back when. And if you can't see that that's happening, and this is how this stacks, like this is how lost in the labyrinth of life we get. And so if you're not aware that this is happening, and where that started was saying how emotions are so tied to this. I think that it's really useful to think about thoughts and emotions as almost two sides of the same coin. We
I love that.
we separate them to talk about them differently because there's a whole thing that we could learn about emotions, and there's lots of things we could learn about thought. And so in that, it's useful to pull them apart. But also they're deeply related, right? As you change your thinking, you change your feeling. If all of a sudden something triggers you unconsciously and you feel a certain way, that will influence your thinking. If they're not the same side of the same coin, they're just so deeply tied, right? So whatever level we want to put them together, and maybe maybe we can do a deep dive on this later. I'm sure we'll come back to this another time. But what's one thing to note about that is that while your thinking is almost always really happening unconsciously for most people, like we just don't see the modeling that we're doing. We don't see the automatic old thought come on and influence our new thinking about this moment, which by the way, is now making a new thought that's becoming a new memory. When we talk about things persisting over time, and let's talk about people watching a certain news channel that scares them a lot and they get really irrational and whatever, it's because all of a sudden you have this really emotional experience of something. And it's not just that one experience. Now, because you're scared of something, you start to look for confirmation bias. You start to look for things that will make that still be true. So all of a sudden you look for news online that's also about the disaster. And then you rewatch this thing. And so now you're getting thoughts coming up on top of a new experience of emergency, but it's making yet another thought. It's making a whole history, like a really ingrained thing. So then somebody else shows up and says, hey, the world's not that bad. There's all these options. We might figure it out. And it's like, no way, right? That's the answer. There's just no way, because this long history that's tied to all this old thinking or thought, all this deep emotional upset about the world, all these things, right? That becomes our sense of self, right? That becomes to a huge degree kind of what we are, what we think is real, how we're modeling ourselves in the world, and what is, right? What's going on. That is the deep ingrained model that we're putting on the world. So there's that. There's this history of just thinking. But our emotions are so tied to that. What we're not going to notice is our own modeling until we're better at this. You certainly can wake up and see your modeling.
Right.
That's absolutely
that's what we're
on the
hoping
table.
for.
Right. But for most people, what you're going to see first is the emotional reaction to stuff, right? And what we end up doing instead of questioning our emotional reaction and actually being okay, like we don't learn that it's actually okay to have not so fun feelings. We actually learn through lots of ways, if we cry as a kid, we're often told by the parent, don't be that way, stop it. So we learn that very unconsciously as a small child, when I feel bad and I'm expressing like I'm yelling or I'm crying or I'm doing whatever, I'm told to not be what I am. So this feeling that I don't like very much is also not okay to my parent, right? They're telling me to not be it. So all of a sudden I'm making a huge villain this feeling. So we actually don't explore feelings. Instead, what we do is we make snap meanings and judgments about a feeling when it comes up, which becomes a thought or a memory that we then put back onto the new moment in our new thinking, and it affects things. And it's this It's this illusion that we're living in. So if we can actually, rather than make a deep meaning or thought along with an emotion, if we could actually just be with emotions as they come up, actually make all of your emotions more okay. Again, be in the moment, right? Like drop the whole
drop the meaning, keep the sensation.
Totally, right? Drop the meaning, keep the sensation. Now all of a sudden our emotions don't have that same meaning, like, oh, this isn't sadness. It now just becomes a warmth or a heaviness or a something else. So it's nothing. We can actually learn that, oh, these are okay to feel. And I don't have to create this historical drama that's going to then affect everything else that's going on. And I want to make that clear. I mean, all of that is so abstract, but there's very clear examples of how we all do that. We do this all the time. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, we definitely, at least I definitely want to come back to memory in a more, a more deep dive. I want to come back to emotions. But the other thing that I wanted to kind of shine the light on that I thought of when you were talking, looking at modeling, and part of modeling being thoughts, which we're also our memories, because they're past. It's past
thinking. Yep.
And if you think about the way that conscious memories behave, they can lie dormant and then come up. I could be like, oh my gosh, I just remember that sweater that made me remember that sweater that I wore in first grade, my first day. And that's a conscious memory that I have, and that comes back up. If so much of this is unconscious, I love when you talk about time and the passage of time, because I'm having a different relationship with it. It's become more of a marker and less of a, like, a solid thing in my own head. But like time, people say, oh, time heals everything, or what, that phrase, time heals everything, or the passage of time. But it doesn't heal memories. Like if you have a model, especially an unconscious one that you don't know, that's not working for you, that happened, when you were way long ago, it's not going to just get fixed. To everything that you're saying, it sounds like it's not going to get fixed by just continuing on. In fact, it's going to be reinforced. And then it's going to pop back up when that first time you have a breakup. And then it's going to pop back up again.
Yeah.
The first time you lose your job, or, it's going to pop back up again it's going to show its head again and again and again, just in the same way a conscious memory can kind of feel like it's dormant, right? Because it's outside of our awareness. And then it's so vivid. You're like, oh, the smell of those cookies remind me of, Christmas with my mom, or whatever. Yeah. Like we're so it's just, I guess just to kind of state that that's another aspect of it.
I love it. I mean, I think that's really good. And that's why I like talking about these as judgments or thoughts or past thinking, and saying, yes, those are memories. But part of the reason that we're pulling that word apart and using a different word, like, why doesn't he just say memory? Because most of the time when we think of memories, we're thinking about when we actually are trying to remember the past. Oh, I have a memory.
Right.
But what we're talking about here is that many of your memories are conscious to you, that you can go find in your memory. But everything that makes up your knowledge, right? Like what we think knowledge is your memory of stuff, right? What you know, what your assuredness of meaning is that you learned somewhere, that guy's bad, this is dangerous, that's safe, I like this, I don't like that. All of those past things are what we think of as our knowledge. And I throw air quotes on that simply because personally, our knowledge feels exactly right. Right. It feels
Right.
perfect. We don't feel like there's any errors in our knowledge. I know what I know, and this is true, and I've got it. But what we actually realize is that in all these subtle little ways, our knowledge has deep errors in it. And I would say that that's not only true for the individual, that's true collectively. That's true for what we're all kind of doing on planet Earth and what we're saying we all should do, et cetera, because we don't understand how knowledge gets coded, how kind of messy it is, how it comes back as a lens and messes up our current thinking about stuff. So even when you know something good, you will bring that back on to paint your current new thinking, and you'll be trying to stuff it into what you already knew worked, right? You'll have some model of what the best way to be in a relationship is. Well, I'm always supposed to do this in a relationship because that's what worked. And I know it. I know that's what worked. So now in this new situation, I'm trying to stuff everything into that. And maybe that works. Maybe that's fine, but sometimes it doesn't. And the fact that we don't see it happening, we don't know that that's what we're doing. It's a very unconscious part of our living. And so this is truly challenging time. self, knowledge, right? What we thoughts, memories, right? We have to really think about these things in more depth, because I don't want this to be something where people are just going, oh, I believe in what Rob said, right? This is not a new thing that I just want you to decide to have faith in. I want you to see this for yourself. Now, that said, if you can't understand every little piece of this, I'm going to tell you, just experience for yourself. Take a few breaths, learn how to be present, come back into this moment. Those are shortcuts into dropping the modeling, coming back in. That can help psychologically in a lot of ways. But as you do dive in and learn more of this stuff, you'll start to see all these little nuances of how we've all been really messing ourselves up with how we make meaning and how we model stuff and how we think about all these different things.
Yeah, and this episode is like so much better than I hoped, because we went
Oh,
through
good.
modeling in self and modeling and all the way to modeling in knowledge. And I think that's such a great way to leave it there. And I hope, like, I just want to call out for our listeners, like what I try to get out of these episodes is I really just want to kind of deep dive into like kind of let us freely discuss something so we can all see it in different ways, because like time is limited, attention is limited. And this one, definitely, I feel like I walked in and I'm like, this is how I understand modeling, what it is. And I get to walk out of it with a new perspective, and just a reminder that like the now is always available. Like, I don't think we could say that enough. Like, I think our whole, every episode from here until eternity could be about how now is available. And there's so much benefit in being able to access it. And we want to help you with that. And also just like to shine the light of awareness, on these things that feel automatic, that feel invisible, that don't even pop into our awareness, or maybe they do and we get curious, but then we push it out because the unconscious is so powerful, because that awareness gives you agency. It gives you more mastery over yourself. It gives you more control over your emotions and your behavior. And so I hope that this episode did that for you too, because I definitely got that out of this.
I love that. So, I mean, if you think about enlightenment, right, what does that mean? It's to bring light to. And so as we're talking about a lot of ways that we could be unconsciously suffering or, messing ourselves up in ways that we're not conscious of how we're modeling, how we're thinking, what are we carrying, what are we valuing? As we bring light to these mechanisms of how we're doing this, just understanding it can give you an awakening that's a bit of an enlightenment, right? It's a little bit of like, oh, wow, I see these things. And through that, you start to prioritize, presence has a lot of value to it, right? Like just that skill of being able to go, how can I come back into this moment and just be here without making any kind of a judgment about it, just really be present. What happens when I do that? Start learning about that. And then also start learning, how can I model better so that we can actually think better, get along better, do relationships better, all these other things. And that's what we're trying to put on the table for everyone. And so it's super fun to do it. I love doing this with you. So I guess on that, why don't we wrap it up? And I appreciate you, Sarah.
We can all walk away a little more enlightened then. I like that. Yeah.
I hope so. Well, listen, at least be kind to yourself and everybody else if you can. Appreciate you very much. Thanks for being here. We'll talk to you really soon. Bye-bye.